June 1945. A gray transport ship moved through the morning fog off the American coast, its decks packed with captured German soldiers. Most of them stared at the harbor like men looking at the moon, but one girl did not look up. She was 19 years old, wearing a loose Wehrmacht jacket that did not belong to her anymore, and both of her arms were folded hard across her stomach. Under the stolen gray cloth, something moved. A small kick. A living secret. 6 months pregnant and surrounded by the enemy. Back in Germany, officers had told her exactly what would happen if the Americans discovered it. They will take the baby from you. They will punish you for carrying a German child. They will smile first, and then they will destroy you. So when the ship's engines slowed and the pier came into view, Marta Vogel pressed her hands tighter over her belly and tried not to breathe too deeply. She expected chains. She expected fists. She expected the posters to come alive. But the first American hand that touched her did not strike her. It held her wrist gently and guided her behind a white hospital curtain. And when the nurse saw the cloth tied too tightly around Marta's stomach, she did something Marta had not been taught to imagine. She closed the curtain. She softened her voice, and she said, through an interpreter, "This baby is not your crime." That sentence would outlive the war. It would cross an ocean. And it would follow a child who first opened her eyes behind American barbed wire. To understand why it broke Marta so completely, you have to begin in the last days of the Reich, when every street in Germany seemed to be swallowing the lies that had built it. Marta had been a teleprinter helper near the Ruhr, one of the young women assigned to messages, cables, and switchboards while the army collapsed around her. She was not important enough to know strategy, not powerful enough to change orders, just old enough to wear a uniform, and young enough to believe the voices above her. By May, the radio spoke in thunder while the world outside spoke in smoke. Rail yards were twisted iron. Church windows had become glittering dust. Civilians moved through broken streets with bags over their shoulders and hunger in their faces. Marta slept in the cellar of a school where the roof was gone on one side and rain came through the classrooms. At night, she wrapped a strip of cloth around her belly to flatten what could no longer be flattened. Her fiancé, Karl, had disappeared somewhere beyond the Oder. One letter had arrived in February, then nothing. No body, no grave. Only a silence so wide that Marta could not look at it directly. The child inside her was the last piece of him that still answered. So she protected it with both hands. Even when the women around her whispered that pregnancy would make her useless, even when an officer warned her that capture would be worse than death, even when the propaganda sheets showed American bombers over German cities and called every man beneath the star a murderer, she believed them. Not because she was foolish, because fear repeats itself until it begins to sound like memory. The Americans arrived at noon. First came the rumble of engines, then white sheets appeared from windows, then a voice on a loudspeaker ordered the soldiers and auxiliaries into the street. Marta climbed out with the others, her boots slipping on broken glass. She expected screaming. Instead, she saw exhausted young men in dusty uniforms, rifles pointed, but faces flat with fatigue. One sergeant walked down the line and checked weapons, insignia, pockets. When he reached Marta, his eyes stopped for half a second on the way her arms locked over her middle. Marta felt the blood leave her face, but he moved on. No accusation, no slap, no question, just a mark on a clipboard. That almost frightened her more. The prisoners were loaded into trucks before evening. The wooden boards smelled of old hay, sweat, and diesel. They passed farms where women were already planting. They passed towns with flags of surrender hanging like laundry from shattered windows. At a transit enclosure, barbed wire ran in bright coils under the sun. There were body searches, roll calls, shouting in English, and rumors that moved faster than the guards. They are sending us to France. No, to the mines. No, to America. A former Africa Corps sergeant laughed without humor and said, "If it is America, pray they do not change their minds. I was held by them once. They fed us better than our own quartermasters." No one believed him. Not fully. How could the country that burned German cities also fill German stomachs? For Marta, the idea made no moral sense. But war was ending, and moral sense had become one more thing people searched for in rubble. Within days, the rumor proved true. The prisoners were put on a train west, then another, then onto a ship at the French coast. Inside the transport, the air was close and metallic. Triple bunks climbed the walls. A bell controlled meals. White bread appeared, coffee appeared, sometimes sugar. Marta ate because the baby demanded it, but every swallow carried guilt. Her mother in Germany might be boiling potato skins. Her father might be trading a coat for flour. And here she was, a prisoner, holding bread soft enough to press with 2 fingers. At night, when the ship rolled in the Atlantic dark, she wrote in a tiny notebook hidden in her boot, "Do not let them find out. If they know, the child will die because I failed to hide it." On the 13th morning, men crowded toward the rail. A coastline appeared, then warehouses, then cranes lifting like black arms through mist. The transport slid toward a military pier, not into the world Marta knew from posters, but into something stranger. A country unburned, windows still whole, cars moving on roads that had not been cratered, men in clean uniforms drinking coffee from paper cups. The smell at the pier was not blood, it was river water, coal smoke, hot metal, and soap. This was the first crack in the story she had been given. Not kindness yet, only order. Only the unsettling proof that the enemy had not been destroyed by the war it had helped win. The prisoners were counted and moved to trains. Marta kept her head down. The rail car took them inland for hours, then days. Cities gave way to forests. Forests gave way to open fields so wide they seemed to have no border. At dawn on the second day, she saw rows of corn, white farmhouses, windmills turning slowly, and red barns standing under an enormous sky. Someone said it was Nebraska. The word meant nothing to her. By afternoon, the train slowed beside a fenced camp built near beet fields and a rail spur. Guard towers stood at the corners. Barracks sat in long wooden rows. There was a flagpole, a mess hall, a clinic, a laundry, and beyond the wire, farmland rolling into heat. A painted sign listed the place as a prisoner of war branch camp under the United States Army. Capacity, several thousand. Marta did not know that more than 370,000 German prisoners would be held on American soil by the end of the war. She did not know there were more than 500 camps and branches scattered across the United States. She knew only that the wire was real, and that medical processing came next. Medical meant clothing off. Clothing off meant the secret was over. The women were taken to a separate wooden building. Inside, the floor smelled of damp pine and disinfectant. White curtains hung from metal tracks. A female officer with clipped hair checked names from a sheet and pointed each prisoner toward an exam space. When Marta's turn came, her legs were so weak she had to grip the table. Behind the curtain stood an American nurse in a white dress, a blue cape folded over a chair. Her name tag read E. Price, RN. She was older than Marta's mother, with silver at her temples and a face that looked stern until she looked closely. "Clothes," the nurse said in careful German. Marta began with the jacket, then the shirt. Then she stopped. The cloth binding around her stomach showed through the thin undershirt, knotted hard at the side. Nurse Price saw it immediately. Marta waited for the shout, for the guard, for the word that would turn the baby into evidence. Instead, the nurse reached behind her and pulled the curtain all the way closed. Then she called for the interpreter. A young woman entered, breathless, wearing a plain civilian dress and a badge pinned near her collar. "My name is Clara Weiss," she said in German. "I was born in St. Louis. My parents came from Hamburg. I am here so they do not misunderstand you." Marta stared at her. Even the interpreter was impossible. German words in an American mouth. The nurse pointed gently toward the binding and asked something. Clara translated. "How far along are you?" Marta could barely make the words. 6 months, maybe a little less. I do not know exactly." Nurse Price's mouth tightened, but not in anger. She loosened the knot with slow fingers. The cloth had cut red grooves into Marta's skin. The nurse inhaled sharply. Then she placed one warm hand against Marta's belly, not pressing, only feeling. The baby kicked. Marta flinched. The nurse did not. Through Clara, she said, "You must not bind yourself like this again. You can hurt the child. You are under medical care now." Marta shook her head. "No, please, do not tell the soldiers." Clara glanced at the nurse, then back at Marta. "She has to write it in your chart, but listen to me. That is not a punishment." Marta did not understand. Nurse Price spoke in small pieces so Clara could carry every word. "You are a prisoner of war. That means the army must feed you. It must treat you if you are sick. It must protect this child because this child is alive." Marta felt the room tilt. The baby is alive. Not German, not enemy, not shame. Alive. That was the category the nurse chose first. The exam continued. Blood pressure, pulse, the cold stethoscope, questions about pain, bleeding, hunger, and when she last had a full meal before capture. The nurse wrote in a chart in neat English letters. Pregnant, special diet, no heavy labor. When Marta dressed again, Nurse Price handed her a folded cotton blanket. "For later," Clara translated. Marta held it as if it were a trick, but no guard came, no accusation came. Outside, the evening smelled of cut grass and cooking fat. Searchlights still stood over the wire, rifles still hung from American shoulders. Marta was still a prisoner, but the life under her ribs had just been named worthy of protection by the army she had been taught to fear. That night, in the women's barrack, she opened her notebook and wrote a line she would return to for the rest of her life. The enemy nurse closed the curtain before she opened the truth. The camp woke at 6. The first morning, Marta expected a crust of bread and black water. Instead, the mess hall smelled of eggs, toast, oatmeal, and coffee. American cooks worked behind a counter, placing food onto metal trays with the bored efficiency of men feeding a machine. When Marta reached the front, one cook looked down at a mark on her card. Then he added an extra cup of milk. "For baby," he said in terrible German, and tapped the tray. Marta almost dropped it. At the table, the women stared at the portions. Eggs, bread, butter, stewed fruit, coffee with milk. The numbers were not whispered to them officially, but the prisoners learned them quickly. Under the rules the Americans followed, camp rations were supposed to come close to those of American troops, roughly 3,000 calories a day when supplies allowed. 3,000. In Germany, Marta had watched children fight over peelings. Here, a defeated enemy girl was being told to drink milk because her baby needed calcium. The shame of it burned almost as much as the relief. One woman muttered, "Eat before history changes its mind." So Marta ate. The eggs were soft and yellow. The bread was white enough to seem unreal, and the milk left a mustache on her lip that made the woman beside her laugh for the first time since capture. Life in the camp settled into a rhythm that felt wrong because it was so ordinary. Roll call, work assignments, meals, mail days, clinic checks. The men left under guard for farms, warehouses, rail sidings, and sugar beet fields. Across the country, hundreds of thousands of German POWs were used as paid labor, often earning small camp wages and coupons. They picked crops, cut timber, repaired roads, canned vegetables, and filled the gaps left by American men overseas. Marta was not sent to the fields. Her chart said no heavy lifting, so she sorted laundry, stamped forms in the administrative hut, and later helped Clara translate simple notices into German. The paper smelled of ink and dust. The office had a fan that turned lazily in the heat. Every few days, Nurse Price or a younger nurse named Ruth Bell called Marta into the clinic. They weighed her, listened for the baby, asked about sleep, asked about swelling, asked if she had eaten. At first, Marta answered like every word might be used against her. Then, one afternoon, Ruth arrived at the mess table with a brown bottle. "Vitamins," Clara said. "Iron." Marta looked at the pills. "In Germany," she said, "we gave iron to soldiers." Ruth smiled sadly when Clara translated. "Here we give it to tired mothers." That was how the old world kept breaking. Not in speeches, not in arguments, in small corrections. A cup of milk, a clean blanket, a nurse who said mother before prisoner. The prisoners were allowed letters through the Red Cross, small forms with cramped lines. Marta wrote home carefully. She told her parents she was alive. She did not tell them about the baby. She could not fit that truth into a box that small. Weeks later, her mother's reply arrived, folded and refolded until the paper felt like cloth. The house had lost its windows. A neighbor had vanished. Food was scarce. Carl was still missing. No one knew if he had crossed west, died east, or disappeared into the churn of armies and roads. Marta read the letter behind the laundry hut where no one would see her face. Then she pressed both hands to her stomach and whispered, "You are what is left." That night she wrote, "I eat better as a prisoner than my family eats as Germans. I do not know what to do with this fact." The camp had cruelty inside it, too. Not grand cruelty, daily cruelty. A guard who called the prisoners krauts as if the word were a stone. A work detail that came back sunburned and silent. A searchlight that swept the barracks at night and reminded everyone the wire was not decoration. Some prisoners refused to speak to Americans unless ordered. Some still spoke of Hitler in low, stubborn voices. Some looked at Marta's growing belly and said she was lucky the Americans liked children more than they hated Germans. She did not know if that was mercy or insult. On Sundays, a chaplain held services in a wooden recreation hall. Hymns rose in German, then English. Sometimes guards and prisoners played baseball on a dirt field, the rules explained in gestures until everyone was confused together. The sight made Marta uneasy. Men who had been shooting at one another months earlier now argued over whether a ball had crossed a line. It did not heal anything, but it made hatred harder to keep simple. Then the photographs came. One hot afternoon, the Americans placed images on the board near the canteen. Thin men in striped clothing, bodies stacked like split wood. a camp gate with a German name over it, captions in English. Clara stood beside Marta and translated what she could. Buchenwald, Dachau, liberated camps, dead prisoners, Jews, Poles, Russians, political prisoners. Numbers too large for the mind to hold. Some German prisoners turned away. One man spat and called it enemy theater. Another began shouting that the pictures were staged. But many simply stood still. Marta stood until her legs ached. She wanted to say she had not known, and that was true. Not enough, but true. She had heard fragments. A labor camp, a transport east, a neighbor who stopped being mentioned, a joke told too quietly, a shop with broken glass that never reopened. The Reich had trained her not only what to believe, but what not to look at. Now she was behind American wire, eating American bread, while American soldiers showed her what German uniforms had guarded. The contradiction was almost unbearable. The country she had been told was barbaric was feeding her unborn child. The country that had called itself civilized had built rooms where children starved behind doors. A few days later, Marta was called for questioning. Her mouth went dry as she followed a guard to a small hut by the fence. Inside, 2 American officers sat at a table with maps, files, and a typewriter. The air smelled of cigarettes and carbon paper. Clara waited near the door. They asked about radio codes, switchboard locations, the names of officers who had vanished before capture. The questions were precise, their voices were tired. No one threatened her. At the end, the older officer removed his glasses. "Did you know about the camps?" he asked. Clara translated slowly. Marta looked at the floor. "No, not clearly." The officer nodded once, not forgiving her, not accusing her, only receiving the answer. "My unit saw one," he said after a moment. "Some of our boys stopped sleeping after that." Clara did not translate immediately. Her face changed first. Then she gave Marta the words. Outside, the sky was huge and blue, indecently beautiful. Marta sat on the clinic steps afterward, unable to move. Ruth found her there with a cup of water. For a while, neither woman spoke. Then Ruth pulled a small photograph from her pocket. It showed a young man in an American uniform, smiling as if war were something happening to other people. "My brother," Ruth said. Clara, who had followed them out, translated. "His name was Daniel. He died in the Ardennes." Marta looked up sharply. The Ardennes. German shells, German guns, German orders. Ruth's eyes were wet but steady. "I could hate you," she said. "Some days I start to. Then I hear the baby. And I think maybe hate is how all this keeps finding another body." Marta had no answer. What could she say? Sorry when she had not fired the shell? Innocent when she had worn the uniform? Grateful when gratitude felt like betrayal of the dead? So she said nothing. Ruth sat beside her anyway. That became another lesson Marta did not ask for. Mercy was not the same as forgetting. It did not erase the camps. It did not excuse the Reich. It did not turn prisoners into heroes or conquerors into saints. Mercy was harder than that. It was a nurse with a dead brother checking the heartbeat of an enemy child because the child had done nothing except try to be born. By late summer, Marta could no longer hide behind loose fabric. Her belly led her into every room. The women in the barrack began saving scraps of cloth. One had been a seamstress in Cologne and stitched small shirts from old undersheets. Another carved a tiny rattle from scrap wood in the workshop. A guard's wife, hearing there was a baby coming, sent a box with safety pins, worn flannel, and 2 knitted booties that did not match. Marta held the booties for a long time. They were soft, blue wool, too small to frighten anyone. The gift embarrassed her. It comforted her. It confused her. Everything in that camp did. In September, the nights cooled. Wind moved over the open fields and rattled the windows of the barrack. Marta woke often with pain in her back and pressure low in her body. Nurse Price told her the baby was turned well. Dr. Harlan, the camp physician, said first births could take time. Ruth told her to breathe when fear climbed too high. Clara told her that if German was the only language she could curse in, the Americans would survive hearing it. For the first time in months, Marta laughed so hard the baby jumped. Then, before dawn on a cold October morning, the laughter was gone. A pain tightened around her back like a belt. Marta opened her eyes. Another pain came lower and stronger. She gripped the edge of the mattress. On the bunk above her, the older woman from Cologne lifted her head. "Now?" she whispered. Marta nodded. The woman did not ask again. She climbed down, threw on her coat, and hammered on the barrack door until the guard outside cursed awake. Minutes later, a lantern moved through the dark. The guard helped Marta into a blanket-wrapped coat and brought a small utility cart used for laundry bundles. Marta wanted to walk. Then the next contraction hit and folded her in half. She let them put her on the cart. The wheels jolted over the frozen dirt. Above the fence, the stars were hard and white. The infirmary was already lit. Inside, the air was sharp with carbolic soap, boiled water, and warm metal. Nurse Price had arrived with her gray hair escaping its pins. Ruth laid out towels and instruments under a lamp. Clara came running in with her coat half-buttoned and her face pale. "You waited for the worst possible hour," Clara said in German, taking Marta's hand. Marta gasped. "I did not choose." "No," Clara said. "Babies never ask the committee." For hours, the camp moved around them as if history had narrowed to one bed. Outside, whistles blew, work trucks started, men marched to beet fields under guard. A flag rose on the pole. Inside, Marta heard only her own breath, the ticking clock, Ruth's instructions, Nurse Price's low voice, and the sea-like rush of pain. By noon, sweat soaked her hair. By afternoon, she began to shake. Dr. Harlan checked the baby and said the heartbeat was strong. Marta heard the word strong and held it like a rope. Strong, strong, strong. At one point, she cried out for Carl, then for her mother. Then, in a voice that sounded younger than 19, she begged Nurse Price not to let them take the baby. The room went quiet around that sentence. Nurse Price leaned close enough for Marta to see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Clara translated as the nurse spoke. "No one in this room is here to take your child. We are here to bring your child into air." Marta cried then. Not from pain, though there was pain enough for it. She cried because some part of her had believed the lie until that exact second. Near midnight, Dr. Harlan's voice changed. Ruth moved to Marta's side. Clara tightened her grip. Nurse Price said, "Now." Marta pushed until the room blurred. Again, again. A sound tore out of her that she did not recognize. Then suddenly there was a silence so complete that every person in the room seemed to vanish into it. And then came the cry. Min, furious, alive. Ruth laughed first. Dr. Harlan lifted a small red child under the lamp. "A girl," Clara said, voice breaking. "Marta, it is a girl." Nurse Price wrapped the baby in a clean cotton blanket and laid her against Marta's chest. The child was slick, warm, and impossibly light. Her tiny mouth opened in protest, her fingers curled against Marta's skin. Marta had thought she would feel triumph. Instead, she felt terror melt into awe. There was no enemy in the room anymore, no flag large enough for the moment. Only a mother, a child, and the women who had carried them through the night. In the morning, the baby needed a name for the records. Clara sat beside the bed with a pencil. Ruth stood near the window, pretending to straighten towels so Marta would not see her waiting. Nurse Price held the chart. Marta looked at the baby's dark hair, her serious little mouth, the crease between her brows as if she already disapproved of the world. "Irene," Marta said. Clara looked up. "Irene?" "In Greek it means peace," Marta said. "Carl once told me that. He liked names with old roots." Then she looked at Ruth, and Ruth for her second name. The younger nurse froze. Marta swallowed. "In Germany, they told me Americans would hurt my child. You stayed when she came. I want her to carry proof that they lied." Clara translated. Ruth covered her mouth with one hand. Nurse Price turned away and wiped her eyes as if the chart had blurred. The official report reduced it to one line. One live birth to a German female prisoner of war. Healthy infant, mother recovering. For the army, it was administration. For Marta, it was the place where the world split into before and after. The weeks that followed were gentler and more frightening than she expected. The baby slept in a wooden crate fitted with blankets beside Marta's bunk. The women passed her from arm to arm. Guards who had once looked through Marta now slowed near the doorway and made awkward faces at the child. One farmer's wife sent powdered formula, another sent a clean bottle. At the clinic, Nurse Price weighed Irene and marked each ounce gained like a military victory. The wire did not disappear. The war's crimes did not shrink. Nothing became simple. But every time the baby cried and Americans moved to help instead of harm, another piece of propaganda lost its grip. Then the order came. Early 1946. Frost lay white on the camp yard. The prisoners were called to formation, breath rising in clouds. An officer read from a paper, "Repatriation, transport east, return to Germany, home." The word should have opened Marta's chest. Instead, it filled her with dread. Germany was hunger, ruins, questions, shame, and a family that did not yet know what she had carried into captivity. America was wire, guards, and a prison number. But America was also the room where her daughter had survived. It was possible, Marta realized, to be afraid of freedom when prison had become the only place where anyone was feeding your child. By the end of 1946, nearly all German prisoners held in the United States would be shipped back across the Atlantic. The victors had Europe to rebuild. The camps were not meant to last. On the morning Marta left, the camp smelled of cold rope, coal smoke, wet wool, and coffee. The women folded blankets, men rolled mattresses. Names were checked, bags were searched. At the clinic door, Nurse Price handed Marta a packet wrapped in brown paper. Inside were 2 bottles, extra cloth, a small tin of salve, and the blanket from the first examination. Ruth handed her a photograph. In it, Marta sat in the infirmary bed with Irene in her arms. Nurse Price stood on one side, Ruth on the other. Everyone looked exhausted. Everyone looked alive. "So she knows," Ruth said. Clara translated, though she did not need to. Marta placed the photo inside her coat. Then Nurse Price touched Irene's cheek with one finger. "You breathe well, little piece," she said. The train to the port moved through bare fields. Irene slept against Marta's chest, warm and solid under the American blanket. At the ship, Marta walked up the gangway without hiding anything. The first time she had crossed the ocean, she had wrapped her body around a secret. This time, the child was visible to everyone. The Atlantic was rough. Waves struck the hull. The women's quarters smelled of milk, damp wool, metal, and fear of what waited on the other side. Marta wrote in her notebook as the ship rolled, "I went to America as a prisoner carrying a hidden child. I return carrying an American blanket, an enemy nurse's photograph, and a daughter named Peace." Bremerhaven was gray when they landed. Warehouses stood broken along the water. Cranes rose over rubble. The air smelled of coal dust, sea salt, damp brick, and old fires. Germany looked smaller than memory. Crowded trains took them inland through a country of gaps. Missing roofs, missing walls, missing men. At a transit station near her hometown, Marta stepped down with Irene in her arms. Her parents stood on the platform. Her mother had become thin. Her father's coat hung loose from his shoulders. For one terrible second, no one moved. The baby stirred. Marta's mother made a sound like something breaking. Then she reached for the child. Marta's father stared at the blanket, at the photograph edge peeking from her coat, at the baby's face. Old shame crossed his eyes, old fear, old rules about what a daughter should have hidden and what a family must not discuss. Then Irene opened her eyes, dark, calm, and alive. Her grandfather reached out with hands rough from cold and work. "She has Carl's mouth," he said. That was all, but it was enough to let Marta breathe. Life after return did not become easy. In 1946 and 1947, food was still short. Coal was short. Windows stayed patched with boards. People counted calories the way they had once counted victories. Marta traded sewing work for potatoes. Her mother boiled soup so thin the spoon showed through it. Irene grew anyway, slowly, stubbornly. Every ounce felt like stolen treasure. The American blanket stayed in the family for years, first around the baby, then folded at the foot of a bed, then inside a cedar chest with the photograph from the infirmary. As Irene grew, Germany changed around her. Rubble carts disappeared from streets, new walls rose where open sky had been, shops filled, trains ran on time again. Adults spoke carefully about the war, then less carefully, then sometimes not at all. But in Marta's kitchen, when the kettle hissed and rain tapped the windows, Irene heard the story. Not all at once, never cleanly. She heard about the propaganda, about the ship, about the nurse who closed the curtain, about food in a prison camp when Germany was hungry, about photographs of camps that made her mother ashamed to breathe, about Ruth's brother who died fighting Germans, and Ruth's hands catching a German child. Irene grew up knowing she had been born in a place that should have hated her. When she was old enough to study, she chose nursing. Marta asked her why. Irene answered as if it were obvious. "If they could care for you when you were their enemy, then I have no excuse to care only for people who are easy." Years later, when former prisoners began returning to America as visitors, some wrote home about farms where they had once worked under guard. They came back in rented cars. They drank coffee with families who had once watched them pick crops. They stood beside old campsites where barracks had become fields again. Marta never crossed the ocean a second time. But Irene did. On an exchange program, she visited the American Midwest. She found a town near where the branch camp had stood. No barracks remained, only flat land, a road, a grain elevator, and wind moving over the fields. She mailed Marta a photograph of the sky. On the back she wrote, "This is where they kept you alive." Marta kept the photograph beside the one from the infirmary. In old age, her hands trembled too much to sew, but she still opened the cedar chest on certain days. The American blanket had yellowed, the photograph had curled at the edges. Nurse Price, Ruth, and the young prisoner mother had all become ghosts in black and white. But Irene's children knew their names. Marta's last diary entry about the camp was only 3 lines. They brought me there as an enemy. They guarded me with rifles. And then they taught me that mercy can wear the uniform you fear. The war was measured in armies, borders, trials, ruins, and numbers too large to carry. But Marta measured its opposite in smaller things. A curtain pulled closed, a cup of milk, a nurse's hand on a bound belly, a baby wrapped in the blanket of a country her mother had been taught to hate. That was the contradiction that survived everything else. Not that America was perfect, not that prisoners were free, not that mercy erased guilt, but that in one guarded room at the end of the worst war the world had ever seen, a frightened German girl learned the enemy did not have to become the monster her leaders had promised. And a child named Peace began her life behind barbed wire, because someone chose care when cruelty would have been easier.